This meeting is called to order at 6:31 p.m. Christina, can you call roll, please?
Stewart,
Here.
Ginoni, Mitchell,
Here.
Rigby,
Here.
Narshak,
Here.
Moreno,
Here.
Ewing.
Here.
No Counselor Mboop today.
Thank you, Christina. Do we have a council member to provide a city council update? No? Okay, so then we move on to the approval of minutes for March 25th, 2024. Do we have a motion to approve the minutes for March 25th, 2024?
I'll move to approve them.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
I'll second that.
Thank you. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Wonderful, thank you. And Christina, do we have anyone to provide public comment?
None tonight.
Okay. So, Commission for Citizen Involvement, general updates. We have a couple of updates. We have an invitation to Forest Highlands Neighborhood Association, FHNA, for their annual membership meeting on Sunday, April 21st. I guess it just passed yesterday from 2:30 to 4:30 at Red Fox Hills Community Clubhouse. If you're interested in finding out what was discussed, you can contact them directly. We also have Oak Creek Neighborhood Association to hear about the recent beautification projects and share thoughts. Tuesday, April 30th, 2024, from 7 to 8 p.m. at the Oak Creek School Library. Contact Teresa Spangler at ccwspang@gmail.com. We have the Glenmorey Neighborhood Association Ivy Pool and Gathering, Sunday, May 5th, 2024, from 2 to 4 p.m. There's a meetup at Glenmorey Drive and Lily Lane, gathering afterwards at 16795 Old River Road. Do I need to read the whole invitation? No? If you're interested, you can contact them at www.glenmorey.wordpress.com or email GNA Board Chair John Bell at jontbell@comcast.net. We also have the Evergreen Neighborhood Association Annual Membership Meeting, Friday, May 10th at 6:30 p.m. Location is the Windward Community Room at 130 A Avenue. To connect with your community, all neighborhood residents, business and property owners are welcome. If you're not on the email list, sign up by visiting the website www.ena-oswego.org. And those are the general updates. So then we have, I believe, a staff update, which is the 2024 Oregon Legislative Session update. The Planning Commission will receive an update on the 2024 Oregon Legislative Session. Staff coordinators are Michael McNamee, Associate Planner, and Madison Thesing, Assistant to the City Manager. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair Marino, for having me, as well as members of the Planning Commission. I'm Madison Thesing. I'm the assistant to the city manager, and as a part of my portfolio, I oversee our legislative agenda and intergovernmental relations.
Hello, everyone. I'm Michael McNamee, Associate Planner with the Planning Department.
Welcome, Michael and Madison.
Thank you. So I'm just going to dive in, and Michael and Jessica and Evan are going to provide technical assistance as they come up, but I'm going to provide an overview of the legislative session as well as important housing bills that came out of session that we're going to be continuing to work on in the next couple months as well.
Thank you.
So briefly, just an agenda. So I'm going to briefly go over the legislative process, our approach to intergovernmental relations, as well as our 2023-24 legislative priorities, and then what was adopted out of the housing and land use bills. So I'm just going to introduce it at the very high level of what is the legislative process. So for the Oregon legislature, we have short sessions and long sessions. Long sessions are on the odd year, which is when they are in session for multiple months. Short session is 30 days, which is what we just came out of. During short session, legislators are allowed to introduce 2 bills, so it's a very condensed, rapid fire of 30 days. As the traditional schoolhouse rock song goes about, I'm just a bill, an ordinated bill, that is the same process that we take in Oregon. So an idea is formed, which then that is during the off session, so during when session is not in place, during the winter and the fall, or excuse me, the summer, fall, and then into winter. An idea is formed, and that can be something like, we need to address housing affordability, or we would like to address e-scooters, the mobility scooters that we've been seeing zipping around. So it comes from a legislative concept. The legislator introduces a bill once session has begun. The bill is then assigned to a committee. Once the bill goes into a committee, that's where they have their public hearings. We're able to provide input. That's kind of like what we would have as a work session for at the local level. Once it's passed out of committee, it typically goes to a second committee as well. Same vetting process. They have a study session, a work session, public hearing, and then it advances to the floor and gets adopted. One thing you'll see in the presentation and then in the packet, we're going to talk a lot about 1537. So one thing that does happen during session is themes, concepts, bills can reemerge from one session to the last. So last time, so in 2023, I joined you all to talk about the governor's housing bill, which was a variance process. At the time, I'm trying to remember when I came. I think it was still in session, so we were in the final weeks, and it was moving forward. We had a lot of concerns with him, especially related to what that meant for our code. Through that process, it came back in this session. We will go through it in depth, but that's just a way of, we continue to see the same types of topics. They just are modified, adjusted, or eventually it just loses wind or it gets passed. So that's always I sometimes mix up my numbers because it's like, oh, I saw this 2 years ago. I saw this 1 year ago. It just keeps reoccurring. So intergovernmental relations for the city of Lake Oswego. We have an intergovernmental relations policy, which is what directs my work, essentially, saying that we have the authority, once blessed by council, to set high priority areas, which then directs how we operate in the 3 policy arenas, being federal, state, and regional. Regional, that's our metro bodies, so JPAC, TPAC, all those little acronyms, as well as the League of Oregon Cities. State is then the legislator when we are actively lobbying and making policy directions at a state level. Federal, we don't do a ton of federal policy. That's just hasn't been a priority, but as tolling has emerged, we've been more involved in transportation funding at a federal level and what that might impact us locally. So I focus all of us actually really focus on state and regional, and that's actually the blessing of Oregon. We're only about 4 million people, so what happens at the state really directly impacts us at the local level. Our legislative agenda is adopted every odd year, so in the long session, I typically come to council with some priority areas, and that's what I'm going to move on to right here. And we have, and this was briefly talked about in the memo as well, the legislative principles, and then we have our priorities. So the legislative principles are the unwavering, every session we believe in home rule authority, unfunded mandate, and leveraging regional and state partnership. This is a lens we always apply to during our legislative process. Then for every odd year, we identify priority areas based off of what's going on in the current trends, what are we seeing in our master plans, which is informing where we want to have our long-term strategic plans move towards. And sometimes state policy allows us either to move faster with that or it hinders our actions. So we can see that a lot of times with clean energy, for housing, transportation, so those broader policy areas. The nice part is because short session happens so quickly, we carry those same priorities from long, being the odd years, to the even. So a lot of these topics dropped off for 2024, so what we just closed, because it's such a focused period of a month. We knew housing was going to be a top priority because of the governor's very laser focus on housing was going to be the thing to address this year. Our topics of related to transportation and long-term funding for transportation will reemerge back in 2025. So it becomes to be kind of a cycle of what topics we want to continue, and we start to identify when are they going to come back into play. That was very long-winded, I apologize. So really 2024, this last session, we knew housing was going to be the priority, and that's what we really focused on. As shared in the memo, what that looked like actually during the off-season, so when they were not in session, is we were able to work really closely with the governor's office and provide, so once the idea was formed in a legislative concept, which was really an outline of what a bill might look like, we were able to work with governor's staff and provide direct edits to what eventually became the bill. In the meantime, we also worked a lot on education of what does housing look like in Lake Oswego and in the Portland metro area. The state is slightly removed, and depending on what district representatives are in, they may not know the different tools we're actively using or what is actually getting built on the ground right now. So thanks to city staff and many others in the region, we were able to go on housing tours. We all got on a bus with the state staff and went to Tigard, Milwaukee, Lake Oswego, and Happy Valley, and really showcase what does the edge of urban growth look like, what does infill density look like, and what are the tools that we're actively using right now that we want to continue to use rather than pull back. It was a great opportunity. I think we really were able to make headways on the bill itself. And so when we did see what eventually came out of the governor's office, which we will move on to, we weren't surprised. And I think that's the biggest takeaway. We were able to make changes where we were able to influence, but we also knew this was coming. And so we've been doing a lot of behind the scenes work to either think through what our code currently has, as well as make suggestions so this was a workable bill. And many of the things that came out of it, and we'll get into it further, are tools and intended to be tools. And so that's one thing that we continue to remind ourselves is this is a tool, and we're going to continue to iterate, because the one thing about this is it's not probably going to be done and we're going to be able to live with this bill forever. We would like to continue to see changes, especially as the landscape of housing changes in the next couple years. So I will get further into the governor's housing bill, but I just wanted to highlight 4 main bills that really did touch on housing directly tied to us as in Lake Oswego. So the governor's housing bill is what you're going to hear the most about. Another thing that came out of this session was the UGB expansion referrals, which is to say UGB expansion cannot be on the ballot for petition. This is in response to something that's happening out in Washington County. You can Google it if you'd like, but basically it should not be up to voters. The caveat with this, our city charter does require it to go to voters, so I just wanted this to be noted that it's something that's happening in the state now, but it doesn't change our personal codes or charters right now. 1530 is a housing production fund. So one thing that came out of this legislative session was also a big emphasis on providing local governments with direct funding for infrastructure to build housing. So the biggest challenge that we have statewide to develop housing is water, sewer, streets, the nuts and bolts of how do you develop a city. And so the legislators heard that loud and clear and then directed direct funding to many cities to provide the immediate funds to increase housing. We were awarded money for a project that is currently breaking ground and it's underway, so the Habitat for Humanity project. Cities throughout the state are now getting a direct funding for infrastructure, which was then limited to water, wastewater, and storm. That was also touched upon in the memo. I think next year, one thing to note about that bill, it was intended to be in the governor's bill initially as a grant of some sort or direct funding. It ended up being pulled and moved into this bill, and then it was project specific. I think next year we might see something come back about a revolving loan or grants that cities can apply for infrastructure specifically related to housing. So I think that's one that might come back, but in a different form too. Lastly is the optional housing ordinances. This one is, I think, a great first step for the state to provide resources to smaller cities. So we're really fortunate for being the size city that we are, that we have amazing staff, we have resources to update our codes, but largely cities throughout the state don't have the staff power, the dollars to spend on consultants to provide guidance on what are best practices when it comes to development ordinances. So the DLCD, so the Department of Land Conservation and Development, will be developing. It's optional to use, but it's great work that I think is happening at the state to increase not only capacity for smaller cities, but also just elevate kind of best practices that are happening throughout the state. Any questions on those three, I guess to say, before we move on to the governor's bill? Okay. So this is the main event, I guess you could say. So the governor's housing bill is was the main focus for not only the governor, but most of the legislative bodies, because it not only was identified as a priority, but it was going to move pretty quickly in that month. The main three things that I have bolded are things that do impact us. I don't want to say that negatively of impact, but it's something that we're going to be looking at really closely. So the first one being the governor's housing bill establishes a housing accountability and production office. You're going to hear it called HAPO, and I'm going to probably call it HAPO for ease for the rest of this presentation. So HAPA will become a new state agency, separate than LUBA and DLCD as another department. So those are two, so land use and land conservation. And what they are intended to do is to be largely internal focused and working on intergovernmental coordination. So what that looks like is if a city is trying to develop with a developer and they're having challenges maybe with TriMet or ODOT or another entity, they're able to be the middleman to make sure that these developments are happening in a timely manner. Additionally, they are there to facilitate when codes are at conflict with each other. So one thing we learned a lot about in the last few years is there's all these state mandates that are coming down, whether it be resiliency, green energy things, or it's land use, and they're at times competing and conflicting as well. And so this office is going to be working internally with the state agencies to make sure that their codes and mandates are no longer conflicting, so that there's clarity for cities to actually comply. And then lastly, and this is the part, there's a memo in your packet that is a memo from DLCD to the state legislator that's really saying that this is supposed to be a helpful, collaborative organization and agency for all partners. And one concern was this is going to create another bureaucracy, another layer of bureaucracy for appeals and processes that really kind of bog down the system. I think this is one that we're going to just continue to watch. They're supposed to be doing reporting, but that is the intention from DLCD, who's going to be working the most closely with HAPO. With that, there is an avenue for appeals. So I know I said it's collaborative, they're going to be working together, but if there's an applicant who is at conflict with a local organization, so a city or a county for a development, they can go to HAPO as a complaint arm. And so that is something that it's just another layer we're going to be mindful of. We're going to continue to watch how this actually is implemented, but the intention is that it's collaborative and not a top-down approach of regulation. Any questions on HAPO? It's the kind of the biggest part, I would say, maybe second biggest part of this bill. Okay. The second bolded section requires cities to grant up to 10 administrative adjustments for local siting and design standards. So this was the big part of what happened in the last session bill that really was saying if developers come forward to a city and they offer an increased housing by 1, then they can waive 10 adjustments. That can be setbacks, that can be height, it could be all, I won't name them all because I don't know them all, but land, or the side, the lot coverage, and they could get waivers for up to 10, as long as they shown that they were going to be increasing by a unit of 1, or there was an affordability tie. This was the biggest contentious part of this bill, I would say, largely, and that's what we worked really hard on for this last off session. At the conclusion of it, and I think this is where we're looking forward to, I guess you could say, is there is going to be an exemption process for those who have for those who have currently a variance process in place. So again, thinking about this is applying to all cities across the state. Not everyone has a variance process like we have today at Lake Oswego and other cities. If we can prove that we allow variances, we have a track record essentially, and if you'll look in your packet, the one-page memos from the different cities really shows how we've approved all variances within the last 5 years. So we have a really strong track record. So there will be a process where we can apply to DLCD to say, look, we have a process that works. We don't need to go through the state regulation of providing exemptions. And at the same time, we have to apply to actually get that this exemption that is outlined in the bill. That will not actually be open, or I guess you could say, or the criteria will not be available until summer. So we have a sense what might be included, but we don't know what the application is. We don't know what the criteria is going to define. They've just talked about it pretty broadly about, that's in the bill, of you have to show so many years of a variance process, the success rate, and then there's a few pieces about what your code what is in your actual code. We are hoping to have that this summer. This whole bill, or especially the exemption process, it goes into effect on January 1. And so we have been talking about what that looks like. We might only have 4 months to change our code and comply so we can get that exemption. We also have a lot of questions for DLCD of, is there a grace period? What does this look like? So there's a lot of behind the scenes as this is getting developed, and they don't have staff hired yet for HAPA or dedicated staff for this process either. So there's just a lot in flux right now, and I wish I could say this is the timeline of how this is going to play out, but we know this is going to take place in summer, and we'll have essentially till January to adopt it. And I say that lightly, and it's not to be lightly. There might be code changes. It's going to come back to you all because we most likely will need to make a few changes to our code, which will then later have to go to council as well. And we don't know what that looks like yet, so more to come there. The last thing I did bold, but wonderful Deputy City Attorney Evan Boone helped highlight what this actually means. So it's direct cities to process housing development application requests and limited land through a limited land use decision. That actually takes place at the current process we have now. So we will not need to make any code changes related to that. So you could disregard my bolded bullet altogether. So the two things that we really are going to be focusing on is the HAPO implementation and then this variance adjustments process. That's the governor's bill in a very brief nutshell. Yes.
Just so I'm clear, so on your 10 administrative adjustments, do we know what they are, or they're still being developed?
We do know what they are. They are listed in the bill, and there's a laundry list to choose from. Some of them apply to any type of housing, and some of them only apply to certain types of housing. So for instance, middle housing or multifamily, manufactured dwellings, that type of thing. So I'm not going to list off the laundry, the full listing here, but Ms. Thesing gave a preview. I mean, it does cover things like setbacks and lot coverage. It also covers things like, let me get to the right page here. Parking minimums, minimum lot sizes, but it puts some parameters on how big those adjustments can be. So for instance, the adjustment to the minimum lot size can't be more than 10%. And again, like the other the setback reductions, those also have limitations on them as well. So be happy to, I think we did include a copy of the entire bill. I can certainly give you the whole section, but rather than reading. What section are we talking about? We
It's
are
page
talking
20.
about section 38. 3, well, gosh, they make this so hard to read, the way that they structure this. So section 38 of House Bill of SB 15, or HB 1537, subsection 2 or 3? No, it is subsection 3.
Yeah,
It will list it there.
it's page 20.
So as a city, do we get to pick which ones we approve of, or it's the state, we have to follow whatever the state has provided?
So we have two choices. We can either just adopt, or we can just apply the state, in which case we have to give all of these exceptions if they're applied for, provided they meet the eligibility criteria, and there are some eligibility criteria, although they're not real high bars. Otherwise, we can apply for an exemption to the state to this mandatory adjustment process. And that exemption, we have to show, well, we don't know fully what the criteria are going to be, but we at least have to show that these listed adjustments, that we have our own process by which people can, applicants can apply for the same adjustments. So at a minimum, everything that's listed in here has to be eligible for an adjustment under our process in our code.
Okay, and that's kind of what sounds like you're leaning towards based on our past history. Okay.
Right.
All right, thank you.
Yes, so this summer, we should know what that criteria is. I think they said July, August? We said late summer is what we're gonna say. At that time, then we'll be able to review our code, we'll be able to review our current process for variances, and then be able to apply. And then we'll have to wait for approval, all assuming we need to be in compliance by January 1 of the new year, and if not, then we default to what the state process is. So that's the next step.
And I would just add that we have a ton of questions for DLCD. And in fact, they just did a sort of an update session with the League of Oregon Cities last week. Was it last week? Yeah, it was last week. And at that session, what they admitted to us is they don't know the answer to a lot of these questions. So what staff is doing right now to prepare for this are two things. The first thing is we're looking at our code right now to see what types of amendments we think we need to make in order to qualify for the exemption. So we're working on that right now. But it's hard for us to even do that because we have a lot of questions about, for instance, there's a minimum density requirement and how they're going to apply that minimum density. And the good news is that these adjustments, if they're what we think, the way that we think that they're applied, is that it requires one of the eligibility criteria, excuse me, I keep stumbling over my words, is that there's 17 dwelling units minimum per acre. And what that comes out to is about 2,562 square feet per unit. So in a typical R7.5 zone, you can't apply for those adjustments unless you have at least 3 units. So it's not going to apply to a single-family dwelling, because that was our concern, is that you can get 10 adjustments to a single-family dwelling in the R10 zone. Well, we don't need more single-family dwellings that are just bigger and bigger. The purpose of this is to increase the number of dwelling units and the production of dwelling units. And so that's one of the things that we advocated for during the process when they were adopting this bill, was making sure that it just isn't going to apply to single-family dwellings across the board. And it looks like if that density does apply to us, the only time you could get it for a detached single-family dwelling, 1 unit on 1 lot, is if you're in the R3, R2, or R0 zone. But that is unlikely to occur in those more higher density zones. So we are looking at our code right now, trying to make sure that we at least based on our current understanding, can figure out where we need to target potential code amendments. The second thing we're doing is coming up with a list of questions to ask TLCD. And what they've asked is that cities send them questions by the beginning of May, and then they've told us what they plan to do is to consolidate all those questions and come up with a Q&A sheet to answer all of the city's questions, because I'm sure there's probably some cities that have similar questions to what we do. Once we have this information, we need to hit the ground running because we have a very tight timeline to get amendments adopted in order to qualify for the exemption.
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
You know, I came onto the Planning Commission during the HB 2001 process. And so ever since, you know, sort of our priorities, you know, each year have been about, you know, handling changes to the code based on, you know, new state housing regulations, essentially. And I think it would be fair to say, you know, considering, you know, the depth of changes that have been required, and I mean, the fact that changes have been required, that those have been pretty thoroughly at odds with that top legislative priority of maintaining home rule. So, you know, has the city been, you know, giving pushback to these, considering, you know, the conflict there?
I would say yes. So I think, especially with this variance piece, that was the number one thing we were pushing for, is if there's going to be requirements related to variances, there needs to be an avenue that we are good actors, we're doing well, we are producing housing like we should be, related to the governor's goals, and allow us to have our current process. So it may not look like we're saying, no, you can't have this bill and fight, fight, fight. It's giving us at least an option to allow for our local adoption of what that looks like. I think, you know, it's challenging to say always we'll fight tooth and nail for home rule authority, because there's times where we want the state to make mandates because it pushes our communities faster into maybe areas that we would not be able to. So I think about a lot of the climate change initiatives that helps us. And I say that because it becomes either state policy, building official policies, and things like that. So I think at all times we want to be able to provide a local lens, be able to implement things with a local perspective. And that might be saying, here's your goal, like housing production is a perfect example. We know what our target is, and we know now how we want it, the tools we want to have, the character we want to maintain, and we're able to adopt tools and strategies at a local level, even though there's this high level, this is what you shall do. So we know that's going to continue to be a thing. I mean, I think that's the nature of why these are becoming state topics and state policies, is we need to make efforts, whether it be housing, transportation, infrastructure funding. And so I don't know if I'm answering fully your question, but I think there's a fine balance of when are we going to say no, 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 and when we know this is going to be the way it's going to be, and we need to find ways to make it locally acceptable and palpable for us too.
If I can expand on that?
Yes.
When we talk about home rule authority, that's a legal concept, okay? And the legislature has granted us the authority to organize ourselves and adopt regulations which relate to the city, okay? Which are not matters of statewide concern, that don't impact the state generally. We are in the hierarchy of things. There's a state, and we're a subdivision of the state, and so we are subject to the state. What is a matter of statewide concern? What impacts outside the city? Well, housing clearly has impacts outside the city. Whether we're producing enough housing, that's, you know, metro. I mean, we have our targets that we have to make, our density requirements, all that sort of thing. The example I guess I would use is this commission is certainly well aware of the climate-friendly and equitable community parking minimum standards. We have CFEC requirements, and the exemptions that DLCD adopted rules that says we can't require any minimum parking. within certain areas of the city with relation to transit corridors, rapid bus service, that sort of thing. That was challenged by 10 cities, and the Court of Appeals just, with the one minor exception, affirmed the rules. So parking minimums are matters of statewide concern. Okay? So housing, tough road to hoe to say that it is not a matter of statewide concern. I think what you're really addressing is, from a policy perspective, how should the state allow local communities address their local situations in order to achieve what the state is trying to do, okay, type of thing. So that's what we kind of argue in the legislature.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Commission? Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Appreciate the updates. Okay, so do we have other business? None? Sure, go ahead.
An email that tomorrow morning at 7:30, there's the future of Lake Grove and downtown LO. Now, this is from the Government Affairs Committee. Do you know? So it talks about parking, transportation, and like quality of life. So I emailed them and I never heard back anything. But it's $30 to come in and listen. So anybody know anything about it?
So this is it's put on by the Chamber of Commerce, and it is a session with the city manager, Bennett, and she's going to talk about downtown and Lake Grove areas, and it's in the context of the CFEC rules, and specifically, there were some concerns from business community about parking and some misunderstandings, so it's an opportunity for her to discuss with the chamber and other attendees about what is the plan for downtown and Lake Grove, how is CFEC going to fit into this, so it's just a general discussion, but it is put on by the Chamber of Commerce.
Is there valuable information that comes out of that related to these topics?
Well, I think so. I'll be honest with you, I don't have, I'm not privy to the presentation, so I haven't seen it. I haven't seen the outline of it, but I plan on attending myself tomorrow morning.
Okay, so you can give an update.
Yes, I certainly can.
Okay, good.
I imagine it's no different information than what you could get if you're listening in on our meetings or even the city council meetings. The chamber creates these events for its members. So I guess it gives their members an opportunity to have an audience with the city manager.
Okay.
Even though the city manager is always available if you reach out to her. So it's a benefit for the chamber members.
Yeah, I figured that's where the cost was connected.
And for networking opportunities too,
Yeah.
so, yeah. Anything else? Any other business to discuss?
I had one more.
Okay.
So this was related to I guess, Jessica, I'm kind of looking at you a little bit, I guess. So from our meeting that we had with City Council on the housing side of things, I was just curious what everybody thought, kind of going through that session, and we proposed, 5 ideas, and then they were all kind of voted down with kind of one maybe. So I personally just felt walking in there not prepared, not knowing what we were going to be doing. So I'm curious what everybody else thought. Is that a typical process where we kind of all voted most of the ideas down, and then maybe one to work on in the future?
So there's 13 strategies that we're putting forward, so I'm not sure what you mean voting all of them down.
Well, there were 5 proposals that were discussed or presented. And then it went to what do we think is a preliminary straw man poll.
Yeah.
And they were all pretty negative, with the exception of
Yeah.
one.
And oh, go ahead,
Sorry,
please.
that the planning commission was going to work on as far as this strategy goes.
Right.
And that was actually something, I had never seen a joint work group like that before. So I think somebody mentioned that it was something new. I believe the mayor mentioned
Yes,
it was.
we've had joint meetings with city council before, but in my recollection, that was the first time it was sort of organized in that kind of format.
With
What I,
straw votes.
what I recall in the past, and I think maybe it was just the nature of the topic, but in the past, a lot of them have just been, work sessions or presentations, and so we would all sort of together provide input. So that, I mean, for me, that was a little different as well.
Yeah, and so my comments on it would be this. So the 5 that we discussed, those were specifically identified as needing further discussion. We kind of knew that a lot of those might not go through. That's why they didn't rise to the top, where we said, well, here's a grouping that we have heard positive feedback from the task force, the planning commission, the city council. We feel confident that these should go in the HPS. You all agreed, yep. And then we kind of went by category. And then those 5 are ones that were like, well, these need further discussion. We aren't sure that these are going to move forward. And that was an opportunity for both the council and the planning commission to provide feedback. And we wanted to do a joint session because we want to make sure you're both on the same page, because this is very important, because the next stage is now we're drafting the housing production strategy report. So we really needed to narrow this down. We've been doing that over the past many, many months, and so this was just sort of the culmination of that. And we'd gotten a lot of feedback on a lot of those previously, so it was just winnowing those last 5 were like, do we really want to move forward with these? So it was not a surprise to us that most of them did not move forward.
Okay, yeah, I mean, it was valuable information for me just to listen to the council discuss the pros and cons of each of them. It was just, I was kind of like, okay, what are we trying to achieve here tonight? Because it doesn't seem to be going well. So that was my, perspective
No,
on
it
it.
did go well.
I guess we
because-
all agreed we didn't like any of them except for maybe one. So I guess that's a positive thing. But it was just, again, new to this. It's like, where are we going with all of this? So,
Yeah.
okay, so I just wanted to try and understand a little bit better.
Yeah, I
just
think
clarity.
the purpose was more to get the people writing the report to focus on what needs to be in the report. And so having
Yeah.
these things kind of, well, maybe not, I think it was valuable to clarify that and,
Provide better direction.
yeah, and
for them.
determine, what would go in, what
Yeah,
doesn't. Because otherwise you're just kind of spinning your wheels if you're saying, well, maybe, and then you take it to a public hearing and then maybe they vote it out again or something. And
Yeah, that meeting went just as we wanted it to. We got clear direction on what strategy should be included and which should not. And so we're hitting the ground running, and our consultant is drafting that report as we speak.
Okay, all right, thanks for the clarification.
Thank you for your questions, Commissioner Shannoni. Anybody else? Any other questions, comments? Having no other business, what is the schedule review?
Okay, so just as a reminder, Planning Manager Olson is on parental leave, and he will be back in June. So I will be covering the next 3 meetings, and I'll just quickly go over them. So the next meeting of the commission is on May 13th, and at that meeting, you're going to get an update on the city's transportation system plans and pathway program, and that will be our traffic engineer, who was just recently actually promoted to assistant city engineer. Will Farley will be presenting that evening. May 29th, I do want to point out that is a Wednesday because your normal meeting falls on Memorial Day. So anytime that happens, your meeting gets moved to a Wednesday. So please make sure you've got that on your calendars. And this should be an interesting meeting. We actually have scheduled some reps from the Department of Land Conservation and Development, DLCD, to come talk about HAPO, which we touched on lightly tonight. And this will be great for staff too, because we have a lot of concerns about how this is all going to be implemented. So they're going to talk about, and HAPO is the Housing Accountability and Production Office that is being formed as we speak. Right now, they're hiring people. They're creating this program, and it's supposed to be effective, I think, on January 1st of 2025. So it's happening fast. So they're going to give us an update on that. They're also going to talk about the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Rulemaking. The acronym for that is ONA. And so they'll give an update on how that rulemaking is going. And just so you know, it doesn't affect our current housing needs analysis that we've already adopted and the housing production strategy we're working on. But the next round, once we do adopt our housing production strategy in 6 years, whatever these new rules are that will be in effect will apply when we do that process 6 years from now. So they'll talk about that as well.
Jessica, if I can interrupt with a question. How will HAPO be different from or interact with OHCS?
My understanding, no, I don't want to speculate on that because I don't know.
Okay.
I think that's a great question when DLCD is here to ask that question. I know that there is Building Codes Division interacts with the Housing Accountability and Production Office, so they have it, but I don't know if OHCS has a role in that. So I don't know enough to answer that.
To me, I'm like, we already have a housing branch of our state government in OHCS, so I'm curious why there was a need for HAPO.
That was an argument that the cities made a lot, is why do we need another agency overseeing housing? Like, we wanted to make sure that they aren't going to duplicate what OHCS is doing or DLCD, and so that was a big concern by the city, by all of the League of Oregon Cities. So, yeah, good question. So I think we'll have some interesting conversations with DLCD when they come on May 29th. And then I'll just go into June 10th is the third meeting out, and that will have a study session with one of our engineering department staff on the stormwater code amendments. I do believe you got an update on that back in March, and so this will be an actual study session on those proposed amendments. So that covers the next 3 meetings. If you have any questions, that's my only update at this point.
No other questions? No? No comments? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And the meeting is adjourned.